gracias. ¿Y tú? ¿Todo
Bien,
bien?
cómo va tu español?
Eh, así.
No importa, lo hacemos en Spanglish, que es lo mejor en
Okay,
esta
very
época.
good.
Janine, me encantan tus historias y noto que tienen en común mucha, como especies de duelos, de buscar la identidad, de recorrer el camino atrás que viene con tu familia, ¿no?
Mhm.
¿Cómo empieza esas ganas de contar ese tipo de historias?
Well, okay, so I'm going to answer in English. I hope it's okay.
Yeah.
I'm my Spanish is like, you know, not great, but also I lose a lot of nuance when I try to explain.
Yeah, that
Um,
happened. Mhm.
yeah. So I think the catalyst for this story in particular was, I found myself in a moment in my life where my identity was under tremendous scrutiny, and I began to ask myself questions about whether or not there was something I was doing wrong, or was there something sort of artificial about the way that I was experiencing my ethnicity and my identity, or the way that I was talking about it or expressing it. Um, and, I had been doing that kind of soul searching my whole adult life, really, since college, but I had never had to do that publicly before. And it was very painful. And it led me into a lot of questions about how I got here. And I started to explore the experiences that my father had growing up, you know, um, sort of shuttling back and forth between St. Louis, a white community in St. Louis, and San Juan, and feeling like he didn't belong in either place. And that obviously led me to his mother and her experiences. And the novel developed really organically from digging into those family stories.
How much did you heal with the story after writing this book? Because it's around it's about home.
Yes. It was a very healing and cathartic experience for me, I think, writing this book. To be clear, my father was of a generation where, although he had a lot of, I think, painful experiences around his identity, he never spoke about them. And in fact, I never heard him use the word identity, I don't think, one time in his life. It was not a thing that he or his siblings really grappled with or talked about. Um, and it was, for me, a sort of way of having the conversation with him that we never got to have when he was alive. Um, I talked to a lot of his siblings. He was the oldest of 8 kids. And I talked to a lot of his cousins who remained in Puerto Rico and grew up there and raised their families there. And I started to understand a lot more about what it must have felt like for those kids who um, were in my dad's family, him and his 7 siblings, like what kind of experience that was for them growing up. They ingested a lot of shame, unfortunately, about their identity. And then we found ourselves, my brother and I, specifically my sister also to a lesser degree because she was younger, but my brother and I spoke Spanish first, only because we lived in Spain. I was born there. My dad was in the Navy. So, we spoke Spanish. And when we moved to the United States, my brother had trouble learning English, much like Benny in this story. And my parents, but, they said no more Spanish at home. And so I remember that feeling of being, you know, made to feel ashamed as a child because we were not great at English. And then 40 years later, after the publication of American Dirt, I found myself in a spotlight being really ridiculed for my broken Spanish and for the way that I was expressing my identity. And it was really painful, but it also was a great source of creativity for me because I thought, like, how did I get here? How did I get from that moment, that child who I genuinely was, to being this adult who I genuinely am as well? What is the transition? What happened in the background that I was not paying attention to? Um, and also, what was happening in the world during that time when the ways that we talk about identity changed dramatically, the ways that we talk about home changed dramatically. All of the language around being Latino, it changes every 5 minutes. Like the words we're supposed to
Yeah.
use or not supposed to use. Um, and
Y
I felt,
también tuviste que experimentar, que te acusaran de apropiación, ¿no? It's like,
yeah,
really?
yeah, no, it was really a strange experience. But I think one thing that was a real gift in the process of writing this book for me was that because I am Generation X, I did not grow up with this same kind of entitlement that younger people have. Like, young people, millennials and younger, will not only have the absolute um, entitlement of identifying themselves in their own terms, but then they will also tell you who you are, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Yeah.
And I was like, hold on, I didn't grow up like this. I didn't feel that freedom or that liberty to define myself in absolute fundamental terms. I largely developed my identity as a mirror of what other people saw about me, but I always felt very proud to be Puerto Rican. And I always expressed that. I was always verbal about it from the time I can remember. And but the notion that somehow I had to prove that to anyone but myself was really sort of deeply ingrained in me growing up. And the great gift of the experience of American Dirt and then writing this book was that I learned this valuable millennial lesson. Like, no, that's not, no one else gets to say who I am. I know who I am, who I have always been. And it's no one else's job to tell me how to identify myself.
Yeah. Se puede decir que convertirte en un bestseller no solo te beneficia como autora, sino que te cambia la vida porque te inicia este camino de vuelta a casa, ¿no? De quién eres, de dónde vienes y todo lo demás.
I think I didn't fully understand. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
that we can say to become a bestseller author, not just change your career, but change your life because make you come back to your roots, where you come from, and all those things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there was, I don't think I could have written this book. Maybe could have is not the right. I don't think I would have written this book without having gone through the experience of American Dirt, because it provoked the kind of questions in me that made me dig deeper into that part of my family history. My father was very private about his own baggage. He didn't talk about it, and um, I knew that he had a tough childhood, and it was, to say the least, so I should say the character Rafaela in the book is based on my grandmother Maria, but they were not the same person. Their circumstances were very similar in that they were born and raised in Puerto Rico into a very well-to-do family. The character and my grandmother, both, when they are teenage girls, their father loses their fortune. They are shipped off to Trinidad to get a job on a naval base where they meet their future husband. All of that was true. It was based on my grandmother's life. But then, Rafaela has a lot of adventures and opinions and resilience and warmth that my grandmother did not have. And one of the other great joys of writing this book was that I was able to sort of give my grandmother a do-over, like a second chance to make better decisions, to be a better mother. And that felt really good, but I don't know if I would have been able to do it while my dad was still alive, because it feels very private, and as if I'm kind of lifting the curtain on his life in a way that I I think he would be proud of, but would have had a hard time with if he were still here.
Did you went to Puerto Rico to walk the same streets and to eat the same foods that they eat in those times? How that feel? How because I recently went back to to my to where I was born after my father passed away, so it
Oh,
feels
sorry.
different. You know, it's like full of memories and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I have been to Puerto Rico many times, and I did go back while I was writing this book to specifically visit the neighborhoods where my dad lived. I wanted to see Las Madres, the school where my grandmother went to school, and I went and visited the church where my dad was an altar boy, and I went and saw his school where he was in elementary school, first and second grade, the house where he lived when he was growing up. Of course, it's totally different, you know. Miramar is probably unrecognizable from what it looked like when my dad lived there as a kid. Um, the food is certainly still recognizable and delicious. And so, in the name of research, I did a lot of eating like alcapurrias when I was there and all the good stuff.
Y la alegría, la música, esa
Me
chispa.
encanta, me encanta. I have to say, my children, my husband is from Ireland, so, and I am half Irish, so my kids are mostly Irish, and yet they are growing up in a home where they have a tremendous number of Puerto Rican influences because I, like Daisy in the book, have spent most of my adult life trying to repair the broken roots and trying to rediscover and establish traditions and customs in our family that have their roots in Puerto Rico in a way that, you know, my dad didn't do when we were growing up because they were made to feel ashamed. And so my poor kids are so confused because they like it's all the Puerto Rican food. We almost exclusively listen to Puerto Rican music in this house. I always say they're not fluent in Spanish quite, but they are fluent in Bad Bunny for sure, you know, and Residente and all the Puerto Rican music, and we visit, and it's a great privilege to be able to share that part of my heritage with them. But you know, I think part of what I wanted to do was give them a childhood where their roots felt simpler and more accessible than mine did. And I think I've actually done the opposite. I've just made them even more confused because they are walking around the world like these two little Irish American girls who are full of Puerto Rican customs. So,
Súper bien. Janine, ¿qué es lo que tú crees, haciendo esta labor de sanar todo lo que estaba, todas esas piezas, all the missing pieces to put it together and to come back to, to your story? What do you think we should do to heal that part in the families that, as yours, have those same things, those same
yeah.
situations?
I mean, I think the first step is to talk about it. You know, a few weeks ago, I had a Zoom family book club with my dad's, all of his surviving siblings, and his cousins who stayed in Puerto Rico and raised their families there. And many of their kids also joined the Zoom. And I had sent them early copies of the book, and they all read it. And I was very nervous because this book is full of, first of all, it's full of true stories from my family, many of which they would recognize. And then secondly, I am opening Pandora's box, you know, and I'm asking them to grapple with these themes that we have never talked about in my family. And so I wasn't sure if the older generation would kind of roll their eyes at me, which was what I feared my dad would have done. Like, oh, what is all this identity nonsense? Much the way Ruth does in the book, you know? But in fact, what I found was that they were all incredibly gracious and open and willing to talk about these things. And it was incredibly validating for me that the way that I imagined the Ruth character in the book feeling in these moments in their childhood my dad's siblings were able to validate, yeah, that's how it felt. And that's how it was for us. And it was a super emotional night. Um, and I walked away from that Zoom feeling like whatever else happens with this book is gravy, because I opened up this conversation in my own family. I feel so emotional right now talking about it. Um, this conversation that we've never been able to have, and now we're having it, and it's such a blessing. So I think this is one of my favorite things about books, right? Is that you can open up the conversation in ways where it's sometimes can be uncomfortable or difficult to get into those themes. But if you read the same book, it's a doorway into a conversation that might otherwise be really difficult to have. Last night, I attended a local book club in my community. It was a mixed group of women. And my favorite moment of the night was when a Korean American woman in the group was like talking about a scene in the book. And she was like, all the yes. And that moment, she was reflecting. There's a moment in the book where two of the characters, Rafaela, who's married to Peter, who is Irish American, and is doing his best and loves her, but really does not understand her challenges living in St. Louis. Um, he's saying to her, like, well, I thought you would really get along well with this woman because she's Puerto Rican. And Rafaela is like, we have zero in common. Why? Just because she's Puerto Rican, I should be best friends with her. And this Korean woman was like, preach. It's all, she's her experience of other people saying to her constantly, like, oh, I have another Korean friend you guys should meet. And she was like, why? Maybe we'll, but it, I've had so many of those moments that feel really validating, and that also have illustrated to me that this is not only a Puerto Rican story or a Latino story. It is a
Mhm.
story for anyone who feels like their roots are complicated and um, challenging, which I think
Yeah.
is like most of us now.
Mhm. Yeah, that happen a lot. Yes, especially
Yeah.
in cities like Miami, where is immigrants everywhere. So, do you feel closer to your dad now?
My dad and I were always very close. My dad was super maternal and, very he was very emotional man. He was super expressive about how proud he was of all of us. And um, I really miss him. He's been gone for almost 9 years, but it feels like 2 days. And um, I struggled a little bit when I first started writing this book because of what I said earlier. I didn't want to betray anything that felt really private to him. But my dad was a deacon in the Catholic Church, and a very spiritual person. And I remember how frequently he comforted people who were grieving by telling them that life is for the living, grief is for the living. It's not for the person who is gone. And you have to honor your life and your own art and your own self in the decisions you make going forward. That is the best way to honor your loved one who has passed. And so, in that way, I know that he would be okay with the book because he's gone. Maybe he would not be so okay with it if he was still here. Um, I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, I still feel really connected to him. And I think I feel even more connected to my grandmother. I managed to find a lot of empathy for her while I was writing this book that I did not have before, because she was not a good mom to my dad. And she was bitter and angry for most of her adult life. And she was also incredibly isolated and sad. And she didn't have the kind of support that women have now. She had 8 kids in a place that felt hostile to her, where she did not have any family support or really even any friends. And so I think we all kind of blamed her when we were young because she didn't do a good job. And it wasn't until I grew up and started looking back at her life and thinking, well, of course she didn't do a good job. Like, how could she be expected to do a good job in those circumstances? And when I was writing this book and I started to learn some of what she endured in St. Louis, for example, the country club scene in the book is a true story. My grandfather joined a country club and they refused to give my grandmother a locker in the women's locker room. They made her go to the staff room to get changed. And, you know, that kind of daily humiliation, what she endured, the prejudice that she endured, I started to just have a lot more empathy for how she ended up the way she ended up.
Wow. Yes. We don't understand why some people are like that until we start investigating more about their past, what they went through, and it's amazing. I'm so happy of reading stories like this one because I know, especially Latinos, we need to talk more about our own stories, our own grief. We're not doing it yet. So thank you so much for this story, Jeanine.
Well, thank you so much. It means so much to me to be here with you, and I really appreciate your openness.
Yes. ¿Dónde se puede conseguir el libro? Website, todo eso, dámelo, dale.
Okay, pues the Spanish language edition will be available starting on July 8th, wherever books are sold. You can get it on Amazon or at your local independent bookstore, wherever they sell Spanish language editions. The English language, which that book will be called Háblame de Casa. And the English language edition is available now everywhere: Target, Walmart, Sam's Club, Amazon, and mostly your local independent bookstore.
Me encanta. Jeanine,
Muchísimas gracias.
qué rico. Vuelve a Miami pronto para conocernos en persona.
Thank
Un
you.
abrazo
Thank you
gigante.
so much.